Hey everyone, I hope you're doing okay. I hope you've had a good 10 days since we last connected with each other um, in talking about the Holocaust and Primo Levi. Um, as you remember, this week we're actually covering two different authors. We're putting together two of our seminars since we were 1 week back. Um, and the way that we're going to do it is that today I am going to be talking about Edward Said and his text Orientalism. Um, and tomorrow, as I think I've already said on campus and as well during our last lecture, that there's an event where I will actually be speaking about Ulrich Beck and his theory of the World Risk Society. So I'm going to be speaking about that text in the context of the pandemic that we're actually living through. And I'm going to provide the information for that. And you can obviously participate alongside everybody else at IE who would want to do that lecture with me. Or I will record it and you can look at it as a part basically of our classroom exercises, up to you. Um, the way that these two seminars, in a sense, are organized is that this lecture on Edward Said. You see, I've entitled it Cultural Imperialism and Dehumanization, the Dark Side of Development. This lecture, in a sense, is going to continue what we've talked about, the themes that we've gone over from a different angle over the last couple of weeks. So we have been focusing in talking about totalitarianism um, and in talking about the Holocaust. We've been talking about this um, idea of loss of identity, dehumanization, um, precisely as a dark side of development, as a dark side of the idea of trying to make progress and innovating to create a perfect human society. So we're going to continue that theme now, talking about Edward Said. Uh, and then in the next lecture on Beck and on what he calls the Risk Society, we're going to essentially shift to our last thematic in this course. After having looked at, in a sense, the dark side of the idea of progress, development, innovation, uh, the ways in which they went, in a sense, nightmarishly wrong in the 20th century, um, we're going to try to think about those concepts today. What does innovation essentially mean in our world? And how might we be able to actually rethink it in a way that is cognizant of everything that's gone wrong with it so that we don't simply treat it uncritically as an unabashed good, the way I think all very often happens at IE, where anything that is called innovation is presumed to be good. And everything that we've looked at thus far over the past couple of seminars would suggest that we should be much more careful about that idea, since innovation can also mean innovating better ways of killing other people. In fact, perfecting ways of creating a machinery, a bureaucratic machinery of death, since that's also how the Nazis talked about the way in which in the way they implemented the Holocaust. As a kind of innovation, as a kind of progress, as a kind of improvement. And they saw it as part of um, innovating towards the perfection of the Aryan race. And for them, obviously, the Aryan race represented the perfection of humanity itself. So we have already, like I said, in the last two seminars, focused on the dark side of the idea of progress and of innovation and of creating the perfect humanity and the perfect society. Um, I've said we have spoken a great deal in the last two seminars about the growth of racial and ideological exclusion of minorities, the rise of totalitarianism, total war, genocide, and the Holocaust, right? And the way that we've talked about those is precisely as the dark side of trying to make progress, that ideological exclusion of minorities was based on the idea that if we're going to create the perfect Aryan race, we have to get rid of, uh, the problematic races, the races that are an obstacle to that kind of Aryan progress. Uh, the Jews. We have to get rid of handicapped people, all of those people that are the opposite of the perfect biological human being. Or in the context of the Soviet Union, if we're going to create the classless society, the class of workers, we have to get rid of all of those people who are not workers, right? Um, so we've seen how this idea of progress and development and innovation can take on this nightmarish cast, can become a way of ideologically excluding those people who are defined as being the wrong kind of people in terms of what perfection would be, what human progress would actually mean. Um, and as Arendt especially talks about it, that process of exclusion, beginning with these people who supposedly stand in the way of historical progress, ultimately leads to a kind of society, a totalitarian society, in which everyone ultimately loses their identity. Um, Everybody becomes one of those people who is expendable because ultimately now what matters is shaping masses of people according to this ideal of what perfection is, so that any individual, their beliefs, their actions, what they do, all of that essentially becomes meaningless. So that starting with an ideological definition of belonging, we end with a totalitarian society in which everyone becomes part of a mass to whom anything can happen at any moment, regardless of what they themselves think or do. Um, and that's the context which obviously leads to total war, to genocide, and to the Holocaust. Uh, where, as I said, in the context of the Second World War, this becomes the occasion actually of working out this ideal, of getting rid of a whole race of people said to be the opposite, the other of the true human beings, whom the Nazis defined as obviously Aryan people. Um, this week, we're going to follow this trajectory from a different angle. And as you'll see throughout what I talk about, when I talk about Edward Said and Orientalism, um, you will see the connections between these two stories that we've been telling throughout. So I say this week we are pursuing this theme of exclusion and dehumanization in the context of European imperialism as applied to those outside of Europe and the West, the so called underdeveloped countries, meaning the Orientals Edward Said discusses. Um, so uh, we're going to continue with, in a sense, the dark side of development, but instead of talking about how this dark side transforms European societies from the inside, we'll see how this idea of development led already to the dehumanization of those who were already defined as not being modern, as not being developed, as not being civilized. And if you remember, Arendt very much connects these two things, and we'll come back to that, the connection she makes between imperialism, what she calls the decline of the nation state, and totalitarianism. But essentially, we're going to now move from talking about the dark side of development in the context of European societies, and we're going to do it in terms of the relationship of the modern West, modern Europeans, and everybody else in the world. Everybody else that they defined as basically being underdeveloped, as somehow being behind, um, as not being almost in the past, essentially, of human history, a past that Europeans themselves had already moved beyond, right? And we'll see what that perception of um, we are ahead on a timeline on which the rest of human beings in the world are somehow behind, how this becomes a means of dehumanization and of imperialism, and sets the scene, if you're going to believe somebody like Hannah Arendt, for the kind of racial exclusion and ideological exclusion that develops in Europe itself. Now, before we come to that, I want to go back and recap some of our discussion about the Holocaust, because remember, I know some people had asked that I record the Zoom meeting, but I forgot to do it. And we had a really a very, very interesting discussion. And so I thought I would go through some of the things that stuck with me, at least, through that discussion. Um, and I hope you'll see that this is what the things that I say to try to recap are actually relevant to the discussion today, because the Holocaust is ultimately maybe our ultimate example of dehumanization. Um, and so, one of the things that we started out with, talking about Primo Levi, was what can we learn about the Holocaust today? Um, Usually when people say the term the Holocaust, uh, usually it seems like there's already a message in there, right? And the message is never again. Um, this was the ultimate example of dehumanization, of genocide, of the attempt to destroy a whole group of people. Um, that it set us, in a way, the great example for what we need to not forget, and make sure that something like that does not happen again. And so that's how we started our discussion. We started talking about um, how do people think about, experience the Holocaust today? What is it? What does never again actually mean? And one of the starting points of our discussion was that, on the one hand, we know that uh, there have been many genocides after the Holocaust. And so, if you go back to the 20th century is really almost a kind of genocidal century, where these kinds of mass killings of people simply because they were the member of some group. Um, they're rampant essentially throughout the 20th century, and many of them after the Holocaust, like the Rwandan genocide, for example. Um, on the one hand, it seems as much as people use the Holocaust to say never again, in fact, something like the opposite is happening, in that many people are increasingly seeing human beings as genocidal animals. They go back and they try to unearth all of the massacres of peoples that have happened throughout history. Um, and the idea is to somehow, shock people, shock our moral conscience that we are capable of doing these things. But the fear, the threat is that it actually has the opposite effect. It makes people feel that, well, this is basically who human beings are. And we talked about how the Holocaust itself has been trivialized in some ways, has been normalized in some ways. Um, where Auschwitz, for example, has become a kind of tourist spot in which people do the same things that they do in our other tourist environments. On the other hand, we talked about, um, is the right way of thinking about never again to treat the Holocaust as though it is a kind of sacred event, which many people treat it as, especially in the Western cultural context, um, where this is the one thing you cannot make fun of. This is the one thing that, in a way, is beyond discussion. Very often, for example, we see um, uh, people say, "Oh my God, look at Muslim people and they go crazy because we just drew the prophet," right? Um, so that is obviously a notion of the sacred, but we have a notion of the sacred, and usually it's the Holocaust. If people try to make fun of the Holocaust and show it in some kind of a comedic light or anything like that, um, people feel like, oh, some horrible sacrilege is kind of happened. And um, a question that we talked about was, is sacralizing the Holocaust in this way, as opposed to trivializing and normalizing it, is that a good way of thinking about um, what we might be able to learn from it? And a number of students, talked about how um, doing that, making the Holocaust and the Nazis simply into the example of a kind of absolute evil of what human beings are capable of, um, that could also have negative repercussions, because that could also be a way in which the Holocaust is used very often by associating other groups of people with it or with the Nazis. Um, Essentially, of continuing to sow conflict and of war. So we talked about, if Palestinians, because they are seen as wanting the destruction of Israel, if they're associated with genocide and the Holocaust, this obviously becomes a justification for Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories. Um, or when the war on terror, as it was called after September 11, the September 11 attacks happened, um, so many new terms like Muslim fascism or Islamic totalitarianism, these terms emerged. And in a sense, what they were doing was saying that this is also the embodiment of a kind of absolute evil, and so it justifies war. Um, so uh, Part of our discussion then was, on the one hand, normalizing genocide and the Holocaust is very, very problematic, but making it into something sacred and the embodiment of absolute evil could also be a way in which it's simply used. And used essentially for purposes that would lead to more suffering in one way or another. Um, so one question that then I asked was, well, if we human beings are not capable of creating the perfect society, if Hannah Arendt is right that the attempt actually to create the perfect society could lead to a kind of nightmarish exclusion of all those people who are seen as being in the way of that perfection, those people are defined as less than human beings, so that the idea of utopia can actually lead to genocide. Um, the question that maybe the Holocaust does allow us to ask, and maybe this is where never again, are we capable as human? Never again becomes meaningful. Um, are we as human beings capable of moving beyond genocide? Are we capable of moving beyond that kind of dehumanization that allows us to kill groups of people regardless of what it is that they have done or think? Um, and For me, in a way, this is fundamentally what uh, Primo Levi's text on survival in Auschwitz, in some ways, is basically about. Since um, it's almost a perfect test case of everything that Hannah Arendt talks about as what happens to people who have their identity taken away from them, right? And I asked, what does Primo Levi seek to convey by highlighting all the ways in which the Jewish prisoners at Auschwitz were deprived of their identity and dehumanized? And what I got out of our discussion about the text itself was, this is what Primo Levi more than anything focuses in, right? He focuses on, right? He focuses um, on the way in which the prisoners, the Jewish prisoners in the death camps, were destroyed as human beings, had their identity and their humanity taken away from them before they were actually destroyed um, in their bodies, before they were either died as by being worked to death or from disease, or were then through selection sent to the gas chambers, right? Um, and what I basically get from Primo Levi's discussion of dehumanization and loss of identity at Auschwitz um, is the idea that uh, dehumanization is not something that applies to human beings in their natural state in any sense. Um, it's not that there is any kind of evil group of people or evil nation, or that if people somehow went back to their barbaric state, this is how they would behave towards each other. Dehumanization is something that is done. It's something that human beings actually do to each other in taking their own humanity away and that of the people that they treat essentially in this way. And one of the things that always strikes me the most when I read Primo Levi, and I said this when we were discussing it, um, is that he is so harsh and judgmental when it comes to talking about the survivors, right? The survivors in survival at Auschwitz are not heroes. Especially you see this in the last chapter when he talks about the saved and the damned, the last one that we had that we read together in the class. Um, and you see how basically he shows all of the people who survive, and he's including himself in that, as people who are actually very compromised in their own humanity, as people who have been dehumanized. In some ways, the most human thing that can happen to you if you are one of the Jewish prisoners is to actually die, right? Because this is an inhuman place that dehumanizes people, so that the survivors themselves are, in a way, a representative of what has been done to them. And this is the message that I take out of Primo Levi, which I take him to apply not only to the prisoners, but to everybody who becomes part essentially of this machinery of dehumanization. And so the message that I take out of it is that it's fundamentally the kind of demonization, right, that would lead anybody to take away the identity and the humanity of somebody else. Um, that's at the heart of what ultimately leads to a situation like the Holocaust. And that's the connection that Hannah Arendt also makes between demonization, totalitarianism, and dehumanization. On the one hand, uh, totalitarian movements like the Nazis react to the fragility of identity, the loneliness that Hannah Arendt talks about, the idea that we live in a world in which, um, precisely because identity is not a given and people have to actually establish it for themselves, where people are always in danger of losing their sense of themselves, losing a sense of who they actually are. And that danger, especially in moments of crises, can lead to movements like the Nazi movement. Um, but before that, racist, nationalist movements that try to define identity in an us versus them, that basically say the reason why you feel threatened or that you're at danger of losing your identity are these people, the Jews, the foreigners, whoever it may be. Um, and they try to the idea is that presumably they are offering people a more stable, secure identity by demonizing other people, right? By defining identity in an exclusive way and saying you only can be an Aryan, and all of these other people are actually inferior to you. So you can feel good about yourself, essentially, and who you actually are supposed to be. You're meant to be the perfect part of the perfect human race. But as Hannah Arendt talks about, although totalitarian movements start out by supposedly trying to give people a greater sense, a more secure sense of identity, the reality is they create through this demonization societies in which everybody ultimately is dehumanized. And this is what happens. This demonization leads to dehumanization, both of the people who perpetrate it and of the people that ultimately experience it. And for me, this is the basic message that we can take from Primo Levi's survival at Auschwitz. Um, and so, in a sense, the message is also not to be so facetious in treating the people who do this, the Nazis, or any other group which tries to build its own identity through demonization. Um, that it would be very easy for us essentially to demonize those groups of people. But the message, in a way, is to look at it as a process in which um, we see those people also as human beings and we don't demonize them, and that we see them in demonization, right? One of the dark sides, essentially, of development. Um, in the case of the Nazis, obviously, the dark side, the idea of we are going to create the perfect human race by getting rid of all of those who are inferior in one way or another, right? So this is, I hope, brings together some of the discussion on the Holocaust that we had together in the classroom, and provides us with the jumping off point to talk about um, our focus today, which is on imperialism and dehumanization. But there is a link between these two, and we already had the link when we talked about Arendt, right? If you remember, Arendt starts out in the chapter not on totalitarianism, but on the decline of the nation state and the end of the rights of man. I said that chapter is on the second book she has on the origins of totalitarianism, and that chapter is about imperialism. What is the link then? Well, the link is that it's precisely through the experience of imperialism that European societies come increasingly to define identity and belonging in society in exclusive terms, in racial terms, in terms of who can and cannot belong um, uh, because essentially of their ethnicity, of their blood, of their race. Um, and so it's no surprise then that it's in the context of, the subjects of European empires, as I said when we were in my lectures on that subject, are not citizens, right? They are not judged as members of the community in terms of their uh, opinions and their actions. Um, they are defined by the group of people that they belong to, and then they have special rules essentially that apply to them that divide them off from the people in the metropole, the people in the capitals of the European empires that actually ruled them, right? So, in a sense, uh, defining identity and community in exclusive terms that leads then to essentially demonizing a group of people as not possibly being able to be us, right, or a part of our society. This is what starts with European imperialism, um, and that's why it's in the context of European imperialism that you have one group of people ruling essentially over another group of people as a mass. So for Arendt, European imperialism really does provide many of the signposts for what ultimately comes to be totalitarianism. Um, and this is the context then for moving on to talk about uh, Edward Said um, and his idea of Orientalism, by which he basically means Western cultural imperialism, right? And his argument is that um, it's actually that cultural imperialism that both preceded, made possible formal colonial rule on the part of Europeans, um, uh, and he argues that essentially this kind of Western cultural imperialism has continued and is there even into our own day. And his focus is so much on Islam and the Arab world. Um, and uh, one starting off point is something that we already talked about when, remember, we were talking about Sieyès, and he was explaining, well, how might it be justified, since we're supposed to be creating a new society founded on citizenship, itself founded on rights that we all have as human beings, um, then how might it be justified if we don't allow people who don't have property, or women, um, to be able to be full citizens, to actually represent and make decisions for people in our society? And his argument was, well, it could be that if you don't have property, or if you're a woman, you don't have the capacity to think in universal and human terms, right? And so because you don't have that capacity, on that basis we can basically say, okay, you can't think for everybody, you're incapable of it. um, and so somebody else has to do the thinking for you, someone who can actually think for everybody. Now, that argument was applied for a very long time to people who did not have enough property, and for a very long time to women in European societies. But it was certainly applied to and used to justify European imperialism all around the world. Remember, this is what we talked about, the way that Europeans justified what they were doing in going and taking over so many societies in the post industrial period, um, is that they were actually bringing them this idea of humanity and of civilization, because they were not able to think in terms of progress and of universal humanity. So, Europeans basically had to do this for them. And that's at the heart of what Said means by Western cultural imperialism. The idea that non Europeans, so called underdeveloped peoples, um, don't have the have already clearly don't have the capacity to make the kind of development that Europeans have made, because um, they don't their cultures, their civilizations have not made sufficient progress. um, they don't think in human terms, and so this gives us the right, essentially, because we actually care for everybody. We care about the human race as a whole. We have the right to go and essentially to try to bring them this modern civilization, to bring them the progress that they themselves are not capable of. So you see how the idea of humanity and progress can actually be used to say that a group of people may not be, because of their culture, capable of it. And so it requires Europeans actually to step in, right? It requires Europeans to go and to understand these societies, what they're made up of, what they're like, and then to help them to come in to do something that they can't do for themselves, which is to make the kind of modern progress that Europeans have already achieved, right? And for Said, like I said, this cultural imperialism, right, is not it was already there before Europeans essentially took over the whole world through their industrial and military modern industrial and military prowess, and he argues that it's continued essentially to our own day. What I want to do now is to provide you with something of the context for Said's text Orientalism. When it's written in 1978, he's writing it in 1978 at a moment in which um, most of the world has already undergone decolonization. There are very few European colonies left in 1978. Um, and in fact, what is left are usually settler societies that have broken away from the European countries themselves, like, for example, Zimbabwe, that decolonizes very, very late. Um, so I want to talk a little bit about this process. We talked about how Europeans, remember, this is the map that I showed you in 1900, um, of so much of the world that was already under European imperial rule. Um, and like I said, much of the rest of it in Asia, for example, from China to the Ottoman Empire, and essentially all of South America, um, really the only reason they were not formally taken over by Europeans is that there was massive disagreement about who would actually you know, who would get these spoils, as people talked about it. And so different imperial powers had different spheres of influence in all of these other societies. And economically and culturally, they were, for the most part, also being controlled by European processes of cultural modernization, of economic modernization. They were really satellites in many ways of different European states. So the only way, in a way, they kept themselves alive was to play off different European powers against each other. And this map that you see of Europe having taken over essentially most of the world after the First World War, um, there's even more of the world that comes under European hegemony. So even though the idea is that in Europe itself, now we have to have self-determination, so all of those old traditional empires like the Austro-Hungarian Empire break away and the Ottoman Empire collapses in the First World War. But outside of Europe, um, actually, there's even greater imperial expansion after the First World War, and it happens through the mandate system. Uh, this gives you, again, a perfect prism for understanding the kind of mentality that was applied to non European peoples. By this point, it's kind of understood that you can't just say, well, these people cannot possibly rule themselves, so we have to do it in their interests. Um, but uh, once the Ottoman Empire is broken up, um, you see these areas, Iraq, Transjordan, Syria, the Arab parts of the Ottoman Empire. Um, you see these are Transjordan, Palestine, Iraq. Uh, these are given as so-called mandates to the British. Syria is given as a mandate to France, and the idea, Libya as a mandate to Italy. And the idea of the mandate is that these areas are supposed uh, to um, become eventually independent. They're supposed to eventually be able to run their own affairs, but they're not ready yet. They're not civilized enough yet. So they need Britain and France to help them actually reach the point where they can become independent, right? So under the under the pretense of everybody needs to be able to determine nationally their own fate, um, imperialism is actually expanded after the First World War. And eventually, Egypt, for example, does become formally independent after the First World War. But the reality is that the British have the right to control its foreign affairs. And it's not really until 1956 that it achieves full sovereignty. Um, uh, this is a process of decolonization. So you see that despite that map where it seems Europeans have taken over the whole world, very quickly after the Second World War, you see a massive process of decolonization that starts out in Asia. It starts out already in those mandate areas. You see, Syria becomes independent in 1946. Iraq nominally had already become independent even before then, even though, like Egypt, its foreign affairs are controlled still by the British. But India becomes fully independent in 1947, and immediately you see there's a partition where there is the break between Pakistan, the Muslim majority part, and India itself. Um, and it's a whole process which, by the end of the 1960s, uh, much of the world actually has already been decolonized, right? So the period of the, colonial rule on the part by Europeans of non-European societies is relatively short in human history. Um, and what explains this? What explains this, in a sense, quick turnover from European rule um, to the rise of all of these new nation states in the process of decolonization? One long term reason is that the introduction of Western ideologies already undermines Western imperial rule, meaning that the more Europeans go and they create colonial bureaucracies in the places that they rule, and they educate also native elites, for example, in European languages, and try to rule different areas through those native elites, the more those people also learn about all of those Western ideologies, from nationalism, liberalism to communism. Um, and so the more they learn about these ideologies, the more they apply those ideologies to say, we are no different. Um, we can aspire essentially to the same ideals of national sovereignty, of self determination, of freedom, of human rights. Those things apply to us as much as to anybody else. So, just as women come to fight for becoming full human beings as citizens within European societies, um, the the spread of Western libertarian ideologies uh, also ultimately lead to the breakdown of empire itself. So um, colonized subjects essentially take over Western ideologies and turn them against Western rule itself. Um, and then there are more short term reasons for why it is after the Second World War that there's this massive move towards decolonization. One is the loss of moral authority on the part of Western countries who constantly talked about civilization and progress and humanity. And um, the whole world basically experienced the world wars. Um, this idea that, well, is this what progress is supposed to look like? Um, People's massacring each other, genocide, all of the innovation being used essentially to create better ways of killing people. So the idea that the West somehow represented modern civilization and the perfection of humanity, both world wars, but especially the second one, undermined this idea. Um, and so, what had been the ideological backbone of the idea of empire, we are civilizing people, simply stopped making any real sense after the Second World War. Um, in a sense, Europeans themselves lost face in terms of how they talked about what they were doing in the underdeveloped areas of the world. Um, the second reason is that many of the European empires actually lost their colonies in the context of the fighting of the Second World War. Like the Dutch, for example, lost Indonesia to the Japanese. The Japanese took over many of the different imperial territories. They took over the Indochina, for example, from which is Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos from the French. And so the fact that European powers, the imperial powers, lost these territories meant that very, very quickly after the Second World War, when they tried to reclaim them, um, the populations were not willing to go back essentially to being ruled by these European empires once the Japanese were out of the equation. A third reason is that the European empires themselves made all kinds of promises to their colonized subjects that they would give them independence and freedom after the war as a way of trying to get them to fight on their side actually in the war. So all of these reasons together explain why there is this almost, domino effect of decolonization of these countries moving towards independence after the Second World War. Um, but this is not to say that this process was in any sense easy or smooth, or in some texts, historians talk about it as well. The Europeans kind of gave up and let go. And it really was never like that. Um, Decolonization happened in the context of the Cold War. It happened in the context of the fight between capitalism and communism, between the US and the Soviet Union. And the result of that was something actually quite ironic, which is that um, obviously the communists were spreading a kind of internationalist ideology, right? That's what communism is. It's supposed to be international. The Soviet Union was a union of different socialist republics, each of them that were supposed to be kind of um, national groups like the Russian Socialist Republic or the Armenian Socialist Republic or the Ukrainian Socialist Republic, right? But the state itself was an international state. Nonetheless, if you remember when we were talking about Lenin and the Bolsheviks and how they transformed Marx and Marxist thinking, remember I said that what Lenin did was to argue that the fundamental division in the world, of his world, the fundamental division was no longer so much between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, but between the developed areas of the world and the underdeveloped areas of the world, between the imperial powers in Europe and the backward areas of the world that they were essentially taking over. Why? Because his argument was, well, they are using the exploitation of these underdeveloping areas of the world to be able to maintain higher living standards for their workers, and so getting them to identify with their own nations rather than with other working classes, right? This was their explanation, which, like I said, um, is not the best. It's not an accurate historical explanation, but you can see how this way of talking about the world as the fundamental problem is the problem of imperialism could attract and be attractive precisely to underdeveloping areas of the world that are trying to achieve their own freedom and who want to develop without um, all of that capital investment from the West, which is the reason why so many of them had already lost their freedom and independence in the first place. So um, there was an attraction because Marxist ideology after Lenin was so focused on imperialism. Um, Anti-imperialist groups, which who were really nationalist in their ethos, were drawn to this kind of remade, revised Marxist theory, basically Leninist theory, because of its focus on imperialism and what would be necessary to actually um, get your freedom away from European imperial states. On the other hand, the United States, whom on the face of it, you would think that they would be on the side of self determination. They would be on the side of all of these countries trying to achieve their own freedom and their own independence, right? Um, you would think that, but the reality was that the United States, after the Second World War, was very much focused on making sure that Europe, the most advanced areas of the world, Western Europe, would not actually go communist. This is why they invested through the Marshall Fund massive amounts. You know, people to this day, there are people talking about our pandemic, talk about how we need a Marshall Fund for Europe, right? We need this massive investment basically to take what had been societies torn apart by war to rebuild itself so that they would not be attracted to communist ideology, right? The idea being that if the situation is miserable, that is exactly what is going to lead to the kind of radical ideologies which it already had in the 1930s of communism or of fascism. So the United States commits itself to saving Europe, essentially, stabilizing Europe economically, politically, ideologically, and as a result, it also backs the position of most of the European empires within their imperial strongholds around the world. You see this perfectly in the way that the United States, in a way, takes over from France the fight in Vietnam. You see it in the way in which the United States especially acts in a place like Iran in 1953, where there's a CIA coup against, you see, this was the prime minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh. This is another perfect example. Mossadegh was an Iranian nationalist. The British had, in the imperial era in 1901, they had gotten a concession where they would basically control all of Iranian oil and give some of the revenues to the Iranian state. So at the time when Mossadegh came to power, that concession meant that the British controlled all of Iranian oil, and they would give 17% of the revenues to the Iranian state. Um, and the Iranians thought this is crazy. This is essentially our national wealth, and here is this foreign company under the British basically has the right to take away our national wealth and then just give some part of it. That concession went all the way to 1993. So that's when Iran would have been able, actually, under the contractual terms, to get full control over its own oil again. So Mossadegh tried to change the terms of it to a 50-50 deal, which is what the US had given to Saudi Arabia. The British refused. So in 1951, Mossadegh nationalized oil in Iran. This led to a British blockade of Iranian oil and Iranian exports, which destabilized the country economically and led to all kinds of fears on the part of the US that this could lead to a communist takeover in Iran. There was a communist party in Iran at the time. And so the US, the CIA, put together a secret Operation Ajax, and they went and they toppled the government of Mohammad Mossadegh, and they brought back the monarch in Iran. His name was Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi, who, for all practical purposes, was their puppet in some ways. And so, in many places around the world, the US, in supporting the imperial strongholds of what had been European powers, um, came to fight really what was nationalism, um, under the pretense that it was moving towards communism, right? Um, and so this is why in the third world there was this mix basically where in many places like in Vietnam as well, the people who were communists or who became communists really were national. Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader of North Vietnam, who defeated the French, um, he had started out believing in the Declaration of Independence by the United States and thought that he could get the Americans to support him. Um, but the dynamic of the Cold War and of the US support of Western Europe led to a situation in which many third world countries moved towards the communists, or at least used Marxist rhetoric, anti Western rhetoric, which then worried, obviously, the United States. Um, so, this is part of the context in which Said writes Orientalism in 1978. On the one hand, this fear of the third world, all of these new decolonized states, as potentially moving in their anti Westernism towards radicalism and communism. Um, and the continuing problem of cultural imperialism and cultural autonomy. Meaning what? Meaning uh, many of these places decolonized, right? But what they did was they took over the bureaucratic machinery of the colonial state in many places, in Africa, for example, or even in India. They took over the language of the colonizer as the official language of the state. It was the only one that often could bring together actually everybody. So usually the only thing that many people in these decolonized areas had in common was that they had been part of the same European colony and that they had fought the colonizer and decolonized essentially together. But what brought them together often were uh, the bureaucracy that the colonizers themselves had introduced, the natives that they had educated in Western ideologies. And like I said, they had used Western ideologies like nationalism or communism to try to fight colonialism and Western sovereignty. So the question was still there of who are we really? Through this whole period, we have had actually our identities taken away from us. Um, And we've been subject to this kind of cultural imperialism in which we've had to define ourselves in Western terms, even to get our own independence and freedom. So, who are we really? And this worry about how do we actually uh, create our own cultural autonomy and not simply be kind of versions of what Europeans have done to us and thought about us, this is also the context for Said's Orientalism. Okay, I am going to stop here. And I am now then going to give you a video on Said's thinking in Orientalism, which should not take as long. That I know I always give an estimate that ends up being quite wrong, but I think that video should be between 30 to 40 minutes max. Okay.